For modern Daredevil writers, making Matt Murdock's life hell seems to be the only option, so how does Chip Zdarsky take it to the next level? Woof woof! Hey guys, it's me Marco, aka the Mad Dog, and we're back with another video. Written by Chip Zdarsky and primarily illustrated by Marco Checchetto. Apologies if I didn't pronounce that correctly. The first issue in this run of Daredevil was published by Marvel Comics in February of 2019, with the 50th and final issue being released in August of 2023. And Daredevil has gone too far. In a daze of denial and with a righteous new detective on the force hunting him down, Matt Murdock needs to clear his own name whilst on the run. But what if he wasn't innocent to begin with? And who will take his place when a turf war erupts on the street? I can't imagine there are many things more exciting and daunting at the same time as a comic writer than getting to do a run on Daredevil. He is easily the most consistently well written character at Marvel, and when I start a Daredevil run, I expect two things. First up is quality, but also to watch a man's life fall apart in the most entertaining way possible. And it felt like Zdarsky knew that and took it as a challenge to make his run the most destructive for both Matt Murdock and Daredevil. Straight out of the gate, this lulled you into a full sense of security as we're greeted with the story following Matt trying to clear Daredevil's name as he's accused of being a murderer. And I say it lulled me into a false sense of security because you expect these type of stories to go one way. That he's going to be on the run for a little bit, but then he'll find out that somebody else is behind it. But Zdarsky immediately threw that script out of the window and it completely took me by surprise. And it was great because from the start, Chip was already going after the two things that are at the core of this character: his moral beliefs and the law. He's forced to ask himself questions he never thought he would and place himself on the same level as the very people he goes after. And I loved how despite this manic pace, Zdarsky still allowed Matt the time to really explore this scenario and who he really is if he has gone one step too far. To top it all off, there was a great character introduced early on in Cole North. I have to admit, I rolled my eyes at first and I thought this was just going to be some kind of cop version of Ben Urich, but it was clear from just a few issues that he wasn't afraid of taking it straight to Daredevil. Having this story where there were multiple people coming after Matt made it all the more interesting, and at the same time he refused to lay low and ditch the heroics because he knew he needed to keep his hold on Hell's Kitchen, and it very much felt like the symbol he created behind Daredevil was the most important thing. What was great about Cole is that he did his best to err on the side of the law, but part of the force was working against him because they supported Daredevil. Especially up until Devil's Reign, I loved how Zdarsky included a range of perspectives, even if it was just in a passing conversation, and a character like Cole, who almost had like a 60s sense of righteousness, was cast as a villain because he refused to act within the grey, although that doesn't last for the whole run. But regardless, one of the clear highlights of this entire run was the street fight between Cole and Daredevil. It was tense, grounded, well paced, and had been built up in such a way that I knew I wanted Matt to win, but I also didn't want to see how it would affect Cole if he lost. Zdarsky did such a good job early on of balancing everything out that it made me question why I read a Daredevil run in the first place. And that fight was pretty much a culmination of all of the reasons why. I loved that moment and I can't wait to revisit it when the omnibus is released, which you can already pre-order with the discount codes that we've got with the channel sponsor, Organic Price Books. They've got great packaging, fast shipping, and amazing customer services, and if you use code WOOFWOOF, you'll get $2 off your order. And if you're ordering 3 or more books and you want them to be delivered together, make sure you use code WOOFWOOF, ship it together for 5% off your entire order. Don't worry, you can just copy and paste them from the description down below, and you can use these codes as many times as you like. So I touched on that chaos, and that ability to present two sides of an argument is present throughout, but it's not always done as well. In my review of Charles Soule's Daredevil run, I said how stories for Matt Murdock tend to pick between either focusing heavily on the religious aspect or going towards the law angle, but rarely both at the same time. And at least for the first half, it felt like Zdarsky had chosen law to be at the forefront of the story. Sure, Matt does still visit the church, but there is more focus on the legality and the case that is being built against Daredevil. And what's best about this was how it took that power away from Matt. He couldn't write an opening statement on someone else's behalf or cross-check the evidence because he still had to believe that the law had to be respected, which shows it really understood who this character is because they know the worst situation to put him in. But later on in the run after Devil's Reign, it does seem to neglect those aspects of Matt's life. And sure, yeah, it makes sense in the context of the story, but I just think it's another part of the reason why this book just feels so meh towards the end, and it really just didn't feel that satisfying. We're gonna touch on it later as well, but it felt like the Catholicism angle was more of a crutch so that eventually this story could do a ham-fisted metaphysical deconstruction of this character that kind of abandoned that grounded realism that I really liked from the beginning, and unfortunately because of that it felt a bit daft. But regardless, the way this story evolved from the beginning was phenomenal. I'd like to think that most professional comic writers can do at least a great introductory story arc, but it's about what follows that really defines a run for me. The prison arc, much like the first one, was given so much time to flesh out a deep and complex story that wasn't just there for the novelty of it. At the point where I thought, okay, this is going to neatly resolve everything and it'll go back to the status quo, it burrowed further into the concept. There were so many great moments within this story arc that I'm probably forgetting a few of them just due to the sheer quantity. And I know Brubaker did a Matt in jail story, which was great as well, but here Zdarsky got to explore how that would challenge a character who is so morally righteous. His mere status as a hero makes him a target to both those who want to kill him and others who just want to use him. Some of the most entertaining action happened in this section of the series, and my only complaint is that I wish the time between Matt scenes wasn't as long as some of the issues made it feel. But either way, it's worth it for that first moment when you see Matt Murdock wearing the Daredevil cowl but in prison suit orange. Genius. And don't get me wrong, the storylines Zdarsky was injecting whilst Matt was incarcerated weren't a letdown either. And again, it ties into that chaos that I noticed throughout, because Elektra is thrown into the Daredevil mantle. And this was great. It wasn't just a Marvel Now style quick dismissal of a legacy character, but it felt like this was a logical step in Elektra's history. Having her in the picture also elevated that undertone of what makes Matt so special. Why does he have to be Daredevil, whilst also having him in a place where his identity has been taken from him? Yet that transition that Elektra undertook, of going from the world's deadliest assassin to upholding a moral code that goes against her very training, was fascinating to watch. And I wish they would have done more with that journey, because it felt like she got settled way too quickly after having just one interaction with a shop owner in Hell's Kitchen. As well, I loved her new design. Normally I'm not a fan of offshoots, even though, yeah, this is the guy that got the Hot Toy Falcon cap. But the Elektra Daredevil is great. It has enough of the original to clearly be connected, but black being the primary colour really helped to set it apart and not make it feel like some kind of knockoff a sidekick. Although I do imagine that the internet might disagree with me on that. Speaking of which, when it comes to the designs and art, Checchetto has a great style, and he was on the book long enough to feel like he defined the look. In particular, I loved how alive he made the city feel. He had so many subtle elements that showed there was a world beyond the window, or tower blocks would stand in the background, and there was just a lot of smog in this. It was pretty much smog central, but it gave Hell's Kitchen that claustrophobic, overcrowded feeling that someone must always be watching. The angles he used also kept it interesting, and I'm not just talking about during the action, although that should kind of go without saying. In a conversation, he could bring it in real close, twist the perspective, show it from a low viewpoint, and it kept a lot of those conversation heavy scenes maintaining a great pace. And if you've watched this channel before, you know an artist doing something small a few times can make me notice it throughout the entire run. And yeah, still haven't forgotten about the Eisen identity crisis. And for whatever reason, Checchetto couldn't avoid people sticking the teeth out. And I've recently watched a lot of Top Boy. I don't know if this is his way of illustrating people kissing the teeth, so maybe this is some kind of Hell's Kitchen way of showing disrespect, but I could always spot this. Yet I'll gladly put up with that for how fluid the movement is. I would have been happy with an entire issue of Matt leaping across rooftops because of how great it looked. Yet action still had weight to it, and overall I'm really impressed with his style and want to see more from him. I'm just ready to get this art in a bigger format, and if you're the same and you want the omnibus but you're from the EU and you want free shipping and free gifts with every order, then the only place that you need to go is Comics Bugle. They've been a massive support to this channel and they want to be for you as well, because if you use code WOOFWOOF you'll get 3% off all items that aren't already in a sale, so make sure you're getting your pre-orders in. Another interesting thing Zdarsky did in the beginning was make the city as integral to the story as Matt or Elektra, especially because there's a gang war brewing in the background from the beginning. It's a ticking time bomb just waiting to explode, and he also gave us an inside look into quite a few of these factions. Each of these families felt distinct with their own agendas and advantages, which just made the gang war even more fascinating. When it does all kick off, I liked how Daredevil and Elektra were tied into it, without it being the sole influencing factor on the whole thing. It very much feels like a lot of this would have still happened had they not been in the book. Again though, it's just great because it's putting Matt in the worst situation possible, with him just sitting on the sidelines whilst a city that he spent so many years fighting for falls further into chaos. But this was also where one of my least favourite storylines comes into play. To facilitate the stakes of this gang war, Zdarsky feels the need to introduce a new love interest, who's this woman who works at a bookshop who is so forgettable that I can't even remember her name. She's not more likeable than any of his existing flames, it's clear that there's going to be no future, Elektra's already in the picture so I'm kind of going to be rooting for her, and it felt like the sole reason for the relationship existing was so that Matt could get caught up in the middle of the crime families. It felt like there were so many different ways that they could have done this without needing to slow things down with a love story that never had any chance of going anywhere. But that didn't stop Zdarsky from trying to convince us it would. Hell, I would have been more interested if Matt was trying to go out with a girl in the first issue. But if this was a package deal that I have to accept so that I could get the part of the plan that he had with the Kingpin, then I think it's a fair trade. Now, although those two storylines aren't directly related, they were pretty much happening at the same time. I couldn't help but notice the parallel between Matt falling for this new woman that's toxic to his life, and Fisk falling back into his brutish ways. The family's toy with him, thinking his years as a politician have made him soft, and you know that the beast is just still there waiting beneath the surface. And I think the saddest part about this storyline is that whether he believed it possible or not, he did try to walk away from the life of crime. And to be fair, I've snapped over a lot less than he did, so I kinda get it. And it almost feels like there's a law that if you're gonna do a Daredevil run, it isn't complete unless you bring the Kingpin in. And I hoped he would have been there all the way up until the end, and he was so integral to Devil's reign, but that's just not the case, and his absence in the final arc may be the reason why it felt flat compared to everything else that came before it. As well, I didn't care about Fisk's son Butch, or whatever his name was. It was kinda interesting at first when he connected to Matt Murdock because it gave him a direct link to the main Daredevil story, but this whole thing felt like an afterthought that never really added much enjoyment, and it felt like it was trying harder to set up what was coming after Zdarsky's run more than it was trying to enhance it. And I'll be honest, this may just be my dumb reader self zoning out when I don't care as much, but I don't even know what happened to him in the end. And it does just feel like one of those examples of there maybe being one too many plot threads in here. At least to its credit, it knew when to zero in the focus, and the Bullseye storyline was a perfect example of that. This felt like a mini event, especially in how it pulled in the rest of the Marvel universe, which was really surprising but fun to see. Because Bullseye's the character that Daredevil pretty much always goes up against one-on-one, it made him feel like even more of a threat because he had to bring in characters like Spider-Man and Iron Man. And Zdarsky really leaned into the psychopath Bullseye. This felt like one of the most deranged versions of him that I've seen in a long time. And with tying into that non-stop chaos, I loved how this affected Elektra, as she was going through this journey of not trying to be a killing machine, against the one person that she very much wants to kill. The scariest thing was, despite being so insane, Bullseye was still a master tactician and could constantly throw curveballs. This was such a great arc, and it almost encapsulated everything I loved about this run in just one storyline. Bizarrely though, when I heard people talking about how this run takes a massive dip, I thought it would have been during Devil's Reign. And that's because I have a weird rule when it comes to events. The ones people scream are terrible normally ain't that bad. Civil War. But the ones people don't even mention are normally really bad. And I heard nothing about Devil's Reign, but it's actually quite enjoyable. And yeah, take that with a pinch of salt because I am an event apologist, and it isn't to the same standard as the storylines that came before it, but I don't think it was a massive letdown either. Honestly, my biggest complaint about the event was that it was a bit too small in scope in regards to how far it reached, but I'd probably just describe it as Civil War light. It was the heroes having to be outlaws again, but this time going up against a common enemy instead of just turning Iron Man into the worst person ever. And considering that chaos Zdarsky bombarded Matt's life with, I'm surprised this event didn't go with a less predictable conclusion. But I probably would have been more comfortable if this had been the actual ending to Zdarsky's time with this character, going out with a large-scale bang that puts Daredevil back at the center of the Marvel universe, in a similar way to what Donny Cates did with Venom. That's why it felt like it was meant to be, that this could have been the closing chapter, and thematically it would have made sense, even though I really enjoyed the Elektra vs. Kraven stuff, and that might have felt disconnected had it been the actual conclusion, so I guess it swings and roundabouts. But it's after Devil's Reign where the train really comes off the tracks, and fair warning, it isn't pretty. It isn't even that fun. If anything, it felt like Zdarsky was a victim of his own success. He goes even further into the chaos, and what before was unpredictable just feels unstructured and sometimes incoherent. After everything that came before it in this run, it felt like watching a Tony Ferguson fight from the last 3 years, that you want it to recapture that glory, but the longer it goes on, the harder it is to believe it's going to pull it back. But when the quality was so consistent, even through a lead character change and an event, it's all the more confusing how it just couldn't stick the landing. The worst bit is that there was potential here. Stick, the Hand, the Fist, Frank Castle, all of it had that potential, especially given how Zdarsky juggled so many different factors in the build up to the gang war, but that same level of finesse doesn't come back. Even the Punisher crossover from the beginning of the run was more satisfying, and full disclaimer, that may be because I've only read 2 issues of Aaron's latest Punisher run, but I can't say I felt like I got a full story here. As well, what the hell was that story about with Goldie? This is fully going to be spoilers, so I'll leave timestamps down below, but the guy who showed up in the background of an issue of Miller's run and the lawyer Matt cut a deal with as Daredevil is now an actual guardian angel. Like, did I read that right, or am I smoking crack or something? Actually, don't answer that. This to me felt like the since past moment for this run. They're trying so hard to do a shocking retcon that it's actually the dumbest thing that happens. Sure, when reading a Marvel comic, you can't expect everything to be the same as it is in the regular world, but Zdarsky had done a decent job in the first part of making it feel somewhat grounded in reality. The worst bit is, if you remove this entire storyline, not much else in this book would change, and it epitomizes a lot of the problems I had with the final third of this run. Every side character is suddenly Morpheus. Conversations no longer feel like real people would have them, and instead it's all about choice, purpose, and how Matt is basically the messiah in a war against what I am pretty certain is the actual devil. Now I'm being serious. To add insult to injury, Foggy is killed in the most anticlimactic way possible. This should be the most important moment in Matt's life. Beyond the death of Karen, Elektra, it should probably be on par with him losing his sight. But it barely felt like a memorable moment in this run. I explicitly wrote about this in my notes after reading it because I knew if I didn't, I'd probably forget to mention it. And that's also because Zdarsky reversed the death as quickly as it happened. It was as if I could hear him hitting the undo button. And if you haven't read this run and you didn't heed my spoiler warning, you may be thinking it's because Foggy must have got pushed into the background for characters like Elektra or that new Cole guy, but even he is completely pushed into the shadows once the series relaunches. They took him to an interesting point where he abandons the beliefs that originally put him up against Daredevil and joins up with him, only for him to kinda hang around at the base that they train at and lose all of the potential that they had with the character after all of the hard work had already been done. And I just want to ask this, but why does every modern Marvel run now have to be a metaphysical deconstruction exploring who the very being is? Sure, yeah, you need to know who the character is that you're writing about, but why does it seem like everything in the last 5 years or so has the exact same ending? Yeah, when the Immortal Hulk did it made it feel like it was a conclusion that the story had been aiming for, even if it needed 30 filler issues to get there. Donny Cates's Venom did it in the middle of a company-wide crossover, and you've got Zdarsky doing it here to close out his run. Pretty much everything in the final 2 issues had me asking whether or not this was all a dream. Matt gets a new white costume, which admittedly I kinda liked, and then he goes on this mini journey into death to know more about who he is. Like, it's been 60 years, Matt. You've done great up until this point without that clarity. The problem is, because this just seems to be the thing you do now when you're wrapping up a run, it just felt cheap and the ending was weak. The hands-on going war and Matt and Elektra's commitment to that could have been enough to still end this book on a strong note, but having Matt die just so he could confront the devil and get a fresh start for whoever was writing the book next? Was that in Zdarsky's contract or something? What happened to the days when Bendis would throw Matt in jail and just leave it up to Brubaker to figure out where to go with it? In a run that has been all about chaos and just running with it, this ending with Matt in the role of a preacher that sort of maybe remembers his previous life is a massive letdown, especially with the stakes that were carried throughout the run. But who knows, maybe there's just a pressure that's associated with writing a character like Daredevil, where there have been so many historic runs and the character's been taken in so many different directions that you need to do something major just to stand out. And I guess that's why I wanted to do more of a video essay for this, to try and understand where Zdarsky wanted to take this character and see how well that played out. But I don't want that to sound like a consolation prize, because on the whole this is a thoroughly entertaining run on Daredevil. It's just unfortunate there is a run on Daredevil, so to be remembered as the greatest run ever for this character, it would have to make every issue near perfect, and somehow make people remove nostalgia bias for whatever their favourite Daredevil run is. I feel like Zdarsky knew those odds were against him, and knew exactly what type of stories people were used to with this character, and instead decided to throw as much chaos into the mix as possible, and just ride the wave of consequence. And looking at it from that perspective, he did give us a top tier storyline, and for me, it's one of the best runs out of Marvel in recent years. This is my final verdict, and I can't imagine it's an easy task as a comic writer when you know that you've got to do a run on Daredevil. The character has been blessed over the last 40 years with some of the best superhero runs that the medium has to offer. Miller, Checchetto, Smith, Quesada, Bendis, Brubaker, Wade, Soule, and I think Zdarsky deserves to be as revered as some of those names. With just over 50 issues and an event in the middle, he managed to craft a unique journey for Matt Murdock that felt both familiar but unpredictable at the same time. The way each arc bleeds into the next and the consequences of the past constantly haunt the series is phenomenal, and it forced me to pay attention. The duality between the major characters and how Chip managed to zero in on who they are and what makes them tick and put them in the worst situation possible was done in a way that felt character defining for the likes of Elektra and Kingpin. Even the modern Marvel method of every big run needing an event centered around it managed to somehow buck the trend of just feeling like a cheap cash grab. But it does seem poetic then that a series that is centered around destroying everything that Matt holds dearest derails itself in the final third so that it falls just short of being the greatest Daredevil run. It does suddenly lean too heavily into the supernatural and mystical side and forces itself to be a very on the nose deconstruction deconstruction of the character, which ironically it was already doing a better job in the earlier part when that wasn't the focus. The curse of having too many characters comes back to haunt it, as only a few of them get what feels like a conclusion, and it forgets that Hell's Kitchen was as much a part of this story as Matt, Elektra, or any of the other characters within it. Regardless though, there is a great series here, especially if you decide to stop after Devil's Reign. The Checchetto art is phenomenal, and this would be a great Daredevil run whether this is your first, or maybe just your next. And overall, Zdarsky succeeded at making Matt Murdock's life one of the most well-written car crashes it's impossible to look away from. So if I had to sum up Daredevil by Chip Zdarsky in one sentence: don't expect it to be perfect start to finish, but make sure you don't sleep on this before it gets overshadowed for whatever the next great Daredevil run is. So that's my review, hopefully you enjoyed it. I had a bit of a flu halfway through it, that's why I had to do the voiceover again. But until next time, just make sure that you stay safe, and stay mad all you dogs. Woof woof! See you at the next video.